to The Hollow Between, a podcast of folklore, ghost stories, and the uncanny. I'm Candace, and tonight, beside the lantern light, I have a story for you. So, settle in with a blanket and a cup of something warm, because tonight we wander into the strange and shadowed folklore of the Colorado mountains. There are certain landscapes that seem almost designed for stories, places where the land itself feels ancient enough to remember things, and Colorado is one of those places. I've lived in Colorado for 27 years now, long enough to know the particular silence of the mountains after dark, long enough to understand how quickly weather can turn here, long enough to know that certain roads and forests feel different once the sun has gone down, and perhaps long enough for some of Colorado's old stories to begin feeling a little believable too. The mountains rise suddenly here, immense, silent, watching. Snow lingers high above the tree line long after spring arrives below. Old mining roads vanish into forests. Weather rolls across the plains with startling speed. And in the quiet corners of the state, especially after dark, it becomes very easy to understand why strange stories take root. Isolation has always encouraged folklore, and so has the wilderness. And Colorado, well, it has both in abundance. The stories told here are often different from the ghost stories of older eastern towns. They feel rougher around the edges, wilder, born from mountains, storms, mining camps, lonely highways, and long stretches of silence beneath enormous skies. Over the years, those stories have filled the state with strange beings and unsettling legends. Creatures said to roam the forests, figures glimpsed beside mountain roads, things heard moving through abandoned mines. And perhaps most interesting of all, the stories are still alive. People still tell them, quietly, sometimes laughing, and sometimes not. So we should perhaps begin with one of Colorado's strangest creatures, the slide rock bolter. And yeah, even the name sounds slightly unbelievable. The boulder belongs to a long tradition of lumberjack folklore from the Rocky Mountains and the American West. According to old stories, the creature lived high on steep mountain slopes, clinging to cliffs with a hooked tail. It would wait silently above narrow roads or trails until unsuspecting travelers passed below. Then, the creature would release its grip and slide down the mountainside at terrifying speed, swallowing everything in its path before climbing slowly back uphill to wait again. Most descriptions portray the bolter as enormous, whale-like, jagged teeth and eyes large enough to spot movement far below. Now, clearly, the slide rock bolter belongs more to campfire storytelling than genuine belief. But that's part of what I love about folklore. Not every strange tale is born from fear. Some are born from isolation, exhaustion, humor, and the deep human need to make wilderness feel a little less unknowable. And honestly, if you have ever driven narrow mountain roads with sheer cliffs above you, perhaps the idea of something watching from the rocks doesn't feel entirely impossible. Colorado's mining towns have always gathered strange stories around themselves. And in the high mountain town of Breckenridge, whispers of trolls have lingered for generations. Some versions of the stories likely arrived with Scandinavian immigrants who brought older European folklore westward into the Rockies. Others grew naturally from the landscape itself. Mountains have a way of making old stories feel believable. In Scandinavian folklore, trolls were often creatures of stone, mountain, and wilderness, ancient beings tied to the earth itself, sometimes dangerous and sometimes mischievous, sometimes simply old beyond human understanding. And in Breckenridge, tales persist of strange figures glimpsed among the rocks at dusk, large shapes moving between the trees, faces appearing briefly near abandoned mining tunnels, footprints where no one should have been walking. Most people smile when speaking of the trolls now. The stories have softened over time and become part of our local charm. But beneath many playful legends rests something older, a quiet acknowledgement that mountains can feel inhabited in ways difficult to explain, as though something beneath the stone is listening. Of all the creatures said to roam the American wilderness, none may be more enduring than Sasquatch, the great unseen figure of the forests, tall, hair-covered, immense, half hidden among trees. Stories of wild humanoid beings appear across countless cultures and regions, long before the modern term Bigfoot ever existed. And Colorado, with its vast forests and remote mountain ranges, has produced no shortage of sightings. Campers hearing heavy footsteps outside tents, hunters discovering enormous tracks in fresh snow, figures glimpsed briefly across ridge lines at impossible speed. There's something fascinating about Sasquatch stories because they rarely feel truly monstrous. Instead, they carry a different emotion, a kind of awe, a fear mixed with reverence, as though the creatures represent something ancient and untamed still surviving just beyond the edges of civilization. Perhaps that's why the stories endure. Not because people necessarily believe a giant creature walks the woods, but because many of us secretly hope the wilderness still contains mysteries, that there remain places untouched enough for something impossible to hide there. And in Colorado, especially deep in the mountains after dark, that hope can feel strangely convincing. And if you've ever find yourself traveling through the Colorado mountains in search of strange stories of your own, there's actually a wonderful little shop tucked away in the town of Bailey called the Sasquatch Outpost. Part museum, part curiosity shop, part roadside folklore landmark, the outpost is devoted entirely to Sasquatch lore and mountain mystery. Inside, visitors will find footprint casts, photographs, maps of reported sightings, research displays, local stories, and all manner of wonderfully strange artifacts tied to Bigfoot folklore throughout Colorado and the American wilderness. And honestly, even if you remain entirely skeptical of Sasquatch itself, places like the Sasquatch Outpost remind us that folklore is rarely only about proving whether something exists. Sometimes it is about wonder, about mystery, and about the quiet thrill of standing at the edge of deep woods and feeling just for a moment that perhaps the world can still contain things we don't fully understand. Now, not all Colorado legends belong to creatures. Some belong to roads, to foothills, to lonely places where red stone and shadow seem to hold on to stories long after the people inside them are gone. Near the town of Morrison, not far from Red Rocks Park and the winding canyon roads nearby, stories have circulated for decades about a strange figure known as the Hatchet Lady. Descriptions vary depending on who tells the story, as all good folklore eventually does. Some say she appears as an elderly woman wandering the foothills at dusk carrying a hatchet or small axe. Others describe her as little more than a shadow moving between the rocks near old pull-offs and wooded trails. Teenagers once warned each other not to linger too long in secluded areas after dark for fear of encountering her. Couples parked along lonely canyon roads claimed to glimpse a ragged figure watching from the trees. And hikers sometimes reported hearing footsteps or the sharp crack of chopping somewhere deep among the rocks, only to find no one was there. But what fascinates me most about the Hatchet Lady legend is how human it feels beneath the fear. Some versions of the story suggest she may have once been a real woman, a widow living on the outskirts of Morrison many years ago with a sick husband. After his death, according to local lore, poverty and grief slowly isolated her from the community until she was said to be living alone among the foothills and caves near the Red Rock formations, gathering wood, avoiding people, becoming stranger and more frightening in the eyes of the town with every passing year. And perhaps that's how many legends begin, not with monsters, but with loneliness, with isolation, with someone gradually becoming so removed from ordinary life that they begin to feel less like a person and more like part of the landscape itself. Like many regional legends, the Hatchet Lady shifts depending on who tells the story. Sometimes she's described as a ghost, sometimes as a mad woman wandering the foothills, sometimes as a warning told to teenagers lingering too long in the mountains after dark. But nearly every version carries the same uneasy feeling that certain roads around Morrison should not be traveled carelessly after sunset. And honestly, if you have ever driven through those Red Rock canyons at night with the sandstone glowing dark against the stars and the juniper shadows crowding close to the road, it's not difficult to understand why such stories survive there. Places shape folklore, and some landscapes, they seem almost eager to create ghosts. But among Colorado's stranger legends is one story that feels quieter than others, less like a campfire tale and more like something whispered reluctantly across a cemetery fence. And that is the story of the Vampire of Lafayette. Unlike many legends, this one begins with a real man. His name was Teodor Glava, sometimes recorded as Todor Glava in local accounts. He was a Romanian immigrant and coal miner who came to Colorado in the early 20th century seeking work in the mining communities near Lafayette. His grave still exists there today, and carved into the stone is a word that helped give birth to the legends surrounding him: Transylvania. Now, to us, that word immediately conjures Gothic imagery: castles, vampires, dark forests, Dracula. But for Teodor Glava, Transylvania was simply home, a real place, a region in Romania, the place he had left behind in hopes of building a new life somewhere else. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic, Teodor Glava died and was buried in Lafayette Cemetery. And over time, stories began to gather around the grave. Children in Lafayette reportedly dared one another to visit it after dark. Locals warned that strange things happened nearly every night. Some claimed the grave was unnaturally cold. Others whispered that a tree growing from the burial site could not be cut down. Eventually, as often happens with folklore, the stories became less about the man himself and more about what people feared. A vampire from Transylvania, buried in Colorado soil. And honestly, there is something deeply human about that transformation. Communities have always used folklore to make sense of uncertainty, illness, outsiders, and death, especially in mining towns, especially during difficult years, especially when immigrant traditions and local fears mingle together in unfamiliar landscapes. Many Eastern European cultures carried old vampire folklore long before Dracula became popular fiction. These stories were often tied not to romance or horror, but to disease, grief, and the fear that the dead might somehow continue influencing the living. And when immigrant families brought those stories westward into isolated mining communities already shaped by hardship and loss, well, the folklore naturally changed shape over time. It rooted itself in Colorado. And perhaps the true haunting is not that Theodore Glava became a vampire in local legend, but that a man who came to Colorado searching for a better life slowly became remembered more as a monster than a person. Still, legends survive because they speak to something deeper than facts alone. And as with many old legends, the story grew in the telling. Whispers spread throughout Lafayette of strange illnesses, pale figures moving near the cemetery at night, and lantern lights drifting among the graves after dark. And tonight, beside the lantern light, that is the story I want to leave you with. The Grave Beyond the Iron Fence. In the winter of 1898, snow fell hard across Lafayette. The mining town dimmed early each evening beneath smoke and frost. Coal fires burned in narrow homes. Boots crunched over frozen streets. And long before dawn each evening, miners disappeared underground carrying lanterns into the dark. That winter was particularly cruel. Illness moved steadily through the town. Not dramatic enough to become famous, not catastrophic enough to be remembered widely outside the region, but enough. Enough funerals, enough black clothing, enough coughing heard through thin walls at night. Among those who died was a young woman named Katerina Varga. She had arrived from Eastern Europe only 3 years earlier with her husband, Tomas. Neighbors described her as quiet, beautiful. She was often seen standing outside after sunset looking toward the mountains. When she fell ill, the sickness seemed to consume her quickly. And by February, she was dead. According to local accounts, something changed in the town afterward. At first, the stories seemed ordinary enough. People claimed they saw movement near the cemetery late at night, a pale figure between the gravestones, a lantern flickering where no lantern should have been. Then, livestock began dying strangely on farms near the edge of town, not torn apart, not devoured, but simply found cold and bloodless in the snow. Fear spread quickly, especially among immigrant families who carried older folklore with them from Europe. Whispers began. People avoided speaking Katerina's name aloud after dark. Some insisted they had seen her standing beyond the cemetery's iron fence just before dawn, watching the road, watching the town. And perhaps, under ordinary circumstances, the stories would have faded. But then, Tomas Varga himself became ill. Neighbors claimed he weakened rapidly despite showing no clear sign of disease. He stopped working. He stopped eating. He stopped answering knocks at his door. And when one neighbor finally entered his house carrying broth and firewood, she reportedly found Tomas sitting beside the cold fireplace, staring toward the window. When asked what was wrong, he only whispered, "She keeps coming back." The neighbor later swore there were footprints beneath the snow outside the window. Bare footprints, though the night had been bitterly cold. By the end of the month, fear had taken over reason. A group of townsmen gathered quietly after midnight and walked together to the cemetery, carrying lanterns and shovels. No official record exists of what happened there, but only stories. According to local legend, when they opened Katerina's grave, they claimed her body appeared strangely untouched by decay. Some versions insist there was blood on her lips. Others denied this completely. And honestly, stories like these tend to grow sharper with retelling. But nearly every version agrees on one detail. The men resealed the grave before dawn, and afterward, the sightings stopped. Tomas slowly recovered. The livestock deaths ceased, and the town, eager perhaps to leave behind fear, spoke of the matter less and less over the years. Still, old stories have a way of lingering, especially in places where grief once settled heavily enough to leave a mark. Even now, some locals claim strange things happen near the old cemetery during winter storms. Lantern lights seen moving through falling snow, a pale figure standing beyond the iron fence. And on especially cold nights, when the wind moves softly through the graves, there are those who say the snow sometimes carries barefoot tracks where no living person has walked. Well, now, perhaps that is the true heart of folklore. Not whether every story is literally true, but whether the emotions inside the story are true. Fear, longing, wonder, isolation, the uneasy feeling that certain landscapes hold memories longer than they should. Colorado really is full of such landscapes. Places where weather and silence leave room for stories to grow. And perhaps that is why tales of cryptids, ghosts, vampires, trolls, and wandering figures continue to survive here. Because mystery survives in places that still feel wild. And the mountains, despite everything, remain a little wild still. So the next time you find yourself driving through Colorado after sunset, with the mountains black against the stars and the roads winding endlessly ahead, keep an eye on the tree line. Listen carefully when locals tell you a story. And if not to wander too far from the lantern light, it may be wise to listen. Well, friends, if you have a ghost story, a family legend, uncanny experiences, regional folklore tales, or strange happenings you would like to share, I would love to hear it. You can send your stories to thehollowbetween@gmail.com, and perhaps your story may someday be shared here on The Hollow Between. I'd like to thank you for spending this very first evening with me beside the lantern light. And until next time, mind the hollow between. While many of the traditions, places, and legends discussed in tonight's episode are rooted in history and folklore, the featured narrative was created for The Hollow Between.